Darwin said the sight of a peacock's tail made him sick. If, as he had theorized, nature's present forms were the result of generations of lethal whittling, right? Generations of less survivable forms dying out, leaving the most survivable forms to propagate, then why would an animal's present form retain a flamboyantly impractical trait? Having an enormous, partially iridescent, blue and green wedding train permanently attached to your body just doesn't seem to be the sort of thing that would help you survive. If anything, would hurt you, right? By wasting energy on its development and maintenance, by interfering with flight, by acting as simultaneously a bug light and a grab handle for predators. It seems to be the exact sort of thing natural selection would select out. This is what made Darwin nauseous. This was a stuck-out tongue at his theory of natural selection. How could a tail like that evolve? Well, it wasn't so clear then, but today everyone seems to more or less agree that the reason the peacock's tail evolved is because peahens like it. Of course, there's a further debate to be had as to why peahens like it, and some of this is worth being familiar with, theoretically. Maybe the tails themselves are actually an honest sign of fitness, right? Maybe it shows off the capacity to acquire excess nutrients and or resist pathogens and disease and or survive despite the burden of such an ornament. It's a pretty impressive thing to grow. You'd have to be pretty healthy and capable to grow it. So for the same reason a Lamborghini is an honest signal of excess wealth, maybe the peacock's tail shows off excess health, and so it's attractive. This is Zahavi's handicap principle and the descendant Hamilton-Zuck hypothesis. And maybe in a non-competitive way, the peacock's tail results from runaway selection, perhaps on a pre-existing bias. Right? Maybe before the tails even evolved, the peahens already were disposed to like flashy tails for some totally arbitrary reason, right? I've seen some suggest that the tails look like berry bushes, which peahens might well already have evolved to be into the look of, for the same reason any of us like the look of food. Or maybe there was a reason to like such tails that was initially adaptive, right? Initially related to fitness. Maybe a longer tail actually was useful at first, and so preferring the males with longer tails made sense initially. Whatever the reason, though, so long as there was a pre-existing preference, if a male happened to have a flashier tail, they'd have passed on more genes. And in doing so, those males surely would have passed on both the genes for flashy tails, which they had, and the genes for the desire for flashy tails, right? From the female who desired him and reproduced with him. And so the more tails became flashy, the more flash itself became desirable, starting a cycle of self-perpetuating growth that led to the tail we see today. Basically, a handsome guy is likely to have daughters who like handsome guys because their mother is a woman who chose a handsome guy. This is the basic concept of Fisherian runaway, with some input from Dawkins. And maybe as part of any of these, or even another process unmentioned, females became evolutionarily incentivized to choose males with flamboyant tails because that would give their sons flamboyant tails, which would give their sons more access to mates, which would then place even greater incentive on females to like flamboyant tails. Basically, the circular sounding but actually robust logic of marry the handsome guy because his sons will be handsome, and handsome guys have an easy time getting married. This is the virtuous cycle known as the sexy son hypothesis. And today, most of us are more or less satisfied that some blend of the ideas I've reviewed since I started making noises from your phone a few minutes ago, some blend of these ideas more or less works. The sight of a beard makes me sick. And not just because I can't grow a particularly good one, blondes seem to have an inherent disadvantage in this domain, but because they are far more confusing than the peacock's tail. First, let's just wake up to the idea that beards are a weird trait. There's nothing normal in our clade about a very hairy mouth. Look up our three closest relatives: chimpanzees, bonobos, gorillas. We're the odd cousin. And a full beard is a rather ostentatious thing to have coming out of your face. It's at once impractical and visually spectacular. I mean, you're used to it as a human, but just imagine how absurd a squirrel, or a deer, or a kangaroo would look with a big, bushy beard. And imagine how much more ridiculous if it was one of the only places they had visible hair. Long, thick hair concentrated around the lips is objectively hard to explain. It's impractical or seemingly impractical. It's flashy. It's costly. The same sickening problems of the peacock's tail can be found right under our noses. But the solutions to these problems posed aren't as easily translated. Of course, some people do think the analogy runs through, right? Beards are just to attract mates. It's just to make males look good through flamboyant impracticality. But I have some memories that make me, at a personal level, quite skeptical of these narratives. For instance, my dad grew out a perfectly serviceable beard, thick, well lined up. I thought it looked great. And I watched my mother beg him to shave it daily until he relented. And if I show up to my girlfriend's place with anything more than stubble, I'm greeted at the door with a razor. Now, I'm not closing the door to sexy beard theories. You'll hear all about the research on beards and attractiveness in just a few minutes. And obviously, many individual women adore beards. But could you imagine a peahen wanting her peacock mate to pluck his feathers? Surely someone has spent enough time thinking about this to tell us what's going on here. Today, I'm going to talk to someone who has spent about 15 years thinking about beards. Dr. Barnaby Dixon is a human behavioral ecologist, a researcher and lecturer at USC who uses interdisciplinary methods to investigate human mate preferences and competition. His extensive cross-cultural work has bettered our understanding of a wide variety of physical traits. Everything from women's body ratios to men's body hair has crossed his desk. But today we're going to be focused mostly on men and mostly above the shoulders. Thank you to the donors at macandmurphy.org for sending Barnaby a microphone and for funding all of our hosting and software. Today we talk about beards, to a lesser extent facial masculinity, and the impact of both of these traits on attracting mates and repelling rivals across contexts. Fair warning, this is a surprisingly dense forest to walk into scientifically, but Barnaby is the perfect guide to have on this sort of adventure. Enjoy. I guess the upfront thing to notice is that dimorphism, right, this difference between males and females, is an indicator of male-male competition to begin with. And what we're talking about today is our most dimorphic trait, certainly our most dimorphic visual trait. I don't know if there's a way to quantify the difference in vocal depth between males and females, but certainly from a visual perspective, there's nothing quite as striking as the hairy faces that so many men have. And there's two sides to the sexual competition landscape, and maybe there's more than two. Maybe I'm not thinking clearly enough right now, but there's certainly competition to attract, right? And then there's also competition to repel. So there's competition to attract other mates of the opposite sex, and then there's competition to ward off rivals, or in some cases actually use those ornaments as weaponry, right? There, maybe ornaments is a bad word for them. I guess as just a starting question on the topic, do women in general like beards, right? Does facial hair make us more attractive, or what's going on there?
Right. Yeah, that's a totally valid question, and that's pretty much where I started with the research. I assumed, as you pointed out, like this is something that defines visually masculinity in the most obvious and easily processable way. So surely it must be some kind of badge of masculinity that enhances attractiveness to heterosexual women. And the reality is, I mean, I've lost count of how many studies I've done and the other folks in this area have done. If I was to guess, I would say you could probably split it down the middle and say 50-50 in terms of are women preferring facial hair on the faces of anonymous individuals that they're rating in these studies, and the other 50% will say not really, and that first 50% will say they're somewhat more attractive than clean shaven guys, and that seems to be the pattern across the literature. So then I suppose what you do, if that's the case, is you say, well, that's interesting, first of all. Something isn't just going in one direction. So perhaps we can find the sources of variation, like what's explaining that variation among heterosexual women. And that's kind of the next part that I went on to. So I began with a study looking at women's preferences for facial hair in New Zealand, where I was doing my PhD at the time, and Samoa, where I was doing my field research. And in that study, there were some differences in the magnitude of the preference, but the cross-cultural agreement was that clean-shaven faces were more attractive than the full-bearded faces. And I thought, well, that's kind of an answer to it. But then I looked across the literature during writing up the paper and thought, well, actually, my study is just contributing to that kind of split in what we know already, that there's variation. And these two disparate cultures, for whatever reason, they agreed. And I could have just left it there, but I thought, no, there's probably more to this. And so what I did was I looked at some what you would call individual differences to see whether or not they predict or determine women's preferences for men's facial hair. And I added an extra level to it, which speaks to what you were just discussing, which is, look, the facial hair, it's groomed and contoured to fit around the face, right? So, you might actually not require a very, very big shaggy beard. You might actually require, and I mean require in terms of culturally at that time, it might be more aesthetically pleasing for whatever reason, again, to have some form of thick stubble that gives you a facial shape that's more masculine by using this ornament. And so I included in that study faces that I'd photographed with 5 days of stubble and 10 days of stubble, as well as that 8 weeks of full untrimmed beard and then completely clean shaven the day of the photograph. So what I found with that one was, again, a sample of New Zealand women this time, a different sample that I collected, that there's a non-linear preference. So clean shaven and light stubble were pretty even. And then it was that thick stubble look, which was 10 days, as being the most attractive, and beardedness, full beardedness, being pretty much equal to or slightly below that of the clean shaven face. So it seems like having the ability to grow facial hair and have it match the contours of the facial structure that you would consider to be typically male or masculine, that jawline and framing the rest of the face, was what was attractive, rather than having this perhaps unkempt looking full bushy beard.
That's fascinating, and I can almost hear, an evolutionary psychologist just shuddering to realize that, the most attractive version of this ornament is the one that doesn't appear in nature. Obviously, some men can't grow facial hair, and the ones that do would naturally grow quite a lot of it. But 5 day stubble, you really do need a cultural intervention to create that. I suppose one thing that it's worth just flagging for the audience here is that already, I mean, there's clearly a sexual selection and attractiveness story to be told here, right? There's something to do with attraction happening, but already the peacock analogy is looking a little unclean. I mean, To be equivalent, it would be like if we could survey peahens and find that, half of them kind of like it and half of them kind of don't. No one really has too much strong feelings, and most of them prefer peacocks who trim their feathers to a certain length. Like that would be a really peculiar result that wouldn't really match the prototypical sexually selected ornamental display. I guess I want to get more into the variation work, and
Sure.
I've looked at a lot of your work on this, and I don't think we're going to be able to get into it too much. So I'm apologizing for another big question. What are some of the conditions, right? And you can start wherever you want here, because I recognize, again, there's probably about a dozen things you could talk about. What are the conditions where beards are more or less attractive? And hopefully along the way, if you could just share some of the theoretical reasons why that might make sense. So I've seen, you've worked a little bit on frequency dependence, on menopause, on ovulation, on, mating intent, individual mate value, population density, right? All these different things have come up. If you could pick any of those and just kind of share, strong predictors of variation in preferences for beards, give us an idea of the effect size, then also some of the underlying theory, that'd be awesome.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And really, when I fell backwards into this topic, it wasn't what my PhD was originally on. And I just kind of sat there and thought, I remember sitting doing my first postdoc and thinking, well, there's just this list of hypotheses that I can test now and see whether or not this is going on. And what makes it so interesting is that it is something that's under cultural control, right? You're biologically determined genetically and hormonally as to whether you can grow facial hair, but then culture takes a hold and can cause all kinds of different preferences to change over time within regions, across countries. So I kind of drew up a hit list of hypotheses from evolutionary psychology and from behavioral ecology, and thought, well, this is what I'm going to do and dedicate time to doing. And one of the first ones was looking at big differences among women as a function of their reproductive status. So are they postmenopausal? Are they currently pregnant? And comparing across the groups. And postmenopausal women gave higher ratings than other groups. And at first it's kind of confusing, right? Because one of the hypotheses is that facial hair should at least signal sexual maturity and therefore viability as a mate. So why would it be so important for older women who are postmenopausal and not going to have any more children to find this characteristic particularly attractive? And I kind of had to come down the side of, well, the faces of the guys that I was showing them were probably, old enough, mid-20s to 30s, to be perhaps their daughter's husband or boyfriend, or maybe even their grandchildren. So I kind of had to realize that it may have been a function of the stimuli used. But the main point there is that, again, reproductively capable women and women currently carrying a child were not particularly drawn to facial hair as a sexually attractive trait, although they did rate that thick stubble again as more attractive than clean shaven. So then I got into the evolutionary psychology literature, and at the time there was this theory called the ovulatory shift hypothesis, and it's still around. It's Randy Thornhill, who's an entomologist by training, and Steve Gangestad, who's a evolutionary psychologist. Both are distinguished professors at the University of New Mexico, and they really pushed this hypothesis for a long time. It's still around today, but as I'll point out, some of the fundamental claims have been questioned, at least with regards for preference functions, you might call them, towards masculine traits. And I, of course, picked facial hair. So the theory is that women bypass the costs of selecting a perhaps less investing masculine-looking male when the benefits could be reaped. So if you're more fertile in the middle of your cycle, at the periovulatory phase of your cycle, then perhaps there's a peak in your sexual preferences towards cues of viability, facial masculinity, facial hair, deeper voices, muscularity, height, and so forth, masculine odors as well. So I did the work on the facial hair, and none of it was revealing anything of note with regards big shifts in fertility. And I did this, using the less ideal questionnaires. Then I did the actual hormone research where we validated luteinizing hormone and then looked at individual differences in estradiol and progesterone. This was with Dr. Candice Blake at University of Melbourne, and also with Professor Rob Brooks as well at UNSW, and a few others. Prof. Tom Denson as well was involved. So it was a team of us, and there it's a lot of work. And, I was very lucky to work with these people, but essentially ended up publishing 3 or 4 null findings. So I can fairly confidently say that there's no ovulatory shift that explains variation in women's preferences for men's facial hair. The next one I looked at was the parasite stress hypothesis, which is that it comes from Zahavi and Zahavi's handicap hypothesis, and then the Hamilton-Zook parasite hypothesis in evolutionary biology, which is that if your sexually selected ornament also harbors high degrees of parasites and pathogens, then only those high-quality males can withstand the cost of that and display the ornament fully in order to advertise their underlying genetic quality. And this fits to some degree with facial hair because, of course, it could harbor any number of ectoparasites, bugs and things that could really be quite harmful, especially ancestrally, as tends to be the way that evolutionary psychologists will speak, ancestrally speaking, before technologies like shaving. And think about the term clean shaven. We're clean, removed of parasites. So I was like, well, that might work here. And I did a quirky study where I showed participants pictures of, the standard things that induce disgust responses to pathogens, which are open sores and, buckets of liquid that looks kind of like vomit and faces that look all spotty and unhealthy and pale. And so I used those, but I also included in it pictures of bugs that were crawling on the skin and digging into the skin and attaching to hair to kind of prime participants to think about, those ectoparasites that could be living within patches of hair on the male body. And so I primed them to that with a visual stimuli that had been validated in previous research.
The term quirky did not prepare me for what you were about to say, but please continue.
It's a quirky one for sure. Yeah. But, to me, it made sense at the time. And I it's not a bad attempt, at least, to prime for specific pathogen disgust as it relates to hair. But the result was completely null. I mean, I couldn't have had a clearer null finding if I'd wanted it. And I obviously didn't. I was thinking, this will be a great paper. I could show something really unusual here that's underpinning sexual preferences for facial hair. But it was completely null before and after the prime. Beards were just as attractive. And I looked at individual differences in pathogen disgust, and that wasn't a predictor either. So I used the Tiber 3-domain disgust scale for those listening that are interested in, psych and evolutionary psych. It's a very well used questionnaire, and it's predicted a whole bunch of things from socio-political values all the way through to mate preferences for facial masculinity. It just didn't predict preferences for facial hair. So I kind of ticked that one off my list. I did follow up and do another replication of sorts, and it was equally underwhelming with regards pathogens predicting preferences. So then I moved on to ask other questions surrounding when and why facial hair occurs more often. And I was working with Prof. Rob Brooks at the time at UNSW, and in animal ecologists and evolutionary ecologists and quantitative geneticists, like Rob's background was at the time when I worked with him, that was very much his staple. He was working with these fish, guppy fish, and looking at their color patterns, and the males have these ornamentation of color pattern that the females don't have at all. It's Y-linked, so it's heritable on the Y chromosome, and it's involved in mate choice. But there's massive variation in male guppies in the kind of coloration they have. And so he and others were working on whether or not it's a frequency dependence effect. So is there an advantage to rarity or novelty? If a one male comes along with a different color pattern relative to his conspecifics that he's swimming around with, if you like, then perhaps he enjoys an advantage in attractiveness to females. And of course, in that species of guppies, females mate multiply, right? So they can pick different males. It's part of their mating system. And that's been a well-studied phenomenon in guppies, that in fact there is this negative frequency dependence and an advantage to rarity and color patterns via female choice. And so me and Rob were talking about studies to do together, and that was one that came up. And it's interesting because there's some evidence from the literature, the historical literature, that would suggest that there is frequency dependence. So a paper by a sociologist called Robinson in the mid-1970s looked at facial hair patterns among men who were announcing their marriage in a now completely defunct magazine called the Illustrated London News. And this is quite a prestigious thing, right? So not every Joe Schmo can come along and put their name in the Illustrated London News and tell everybody they're getting married or announcing that they're now engaged. So in some way it was good. It controlled for high status or for people. So these were, kind of people who were influential at the time, politicians and so forth. And Robinson went through 150 plus years of data on looking at the photographs that they uploaded, my apologies, put in this newspaper showing the times we live in. It was actually a printed newspaper back then. And he scored the facial hair. And what he noticed was, and I don't know if this was his intention at the time, but he noticed that each individual facial hairstyle had distinct peaks and troughs. So, for instance, things like mutton chops, just those big sideburns, were really big in the mid-1800s, and then they just dropped off to be replaced by another style, let's say perhaps mutton chops connecting with a full beard, and then that will drop off, and moustache will come in, and then clean-shavenness come in, and they would each enjoy a period of, say, 5 to 10 years or so where everyone was copying, and then everyone started to drop off. And then another style would come in and supersede it. So classically, negative frequency dependent selection. And Rob and I were just talking about experiments to do. And we thought, well, I wonder if we can show this causatively. So we came up with an experiment where we showed 3 different distributions of facial hair to 3 different sets of heterosexual women doing the rating and heterosexual men as well, just to have the sex differences in there. And there were 3 conditions, 500 or so participants in each condition. And the first condition was participants just saw 24, 25, if I remember rightly, faces of just men with full beards. In the second condition, another set of participants saw 25 guys that were all clean shaven. And the third condition, they saw a mixture of clean shaven, stubble, and beard. So that kind of random mixed population. Irrespective of what condition they were assigned to, all participants rated the same set of faces at the end, and there was no distinguishing the faces set at the end compared to the condition. It was just a group of faces that came up at the end, and so participants were just carrying on to rate as if nothing else was going on, but it was part of the experimental design. And we looked at those, I think it was three males presented in clean-shaven, light stubble, heavy stubble, and full beards. And the condition to which they were assigned that varied the frequency of facial hair determined how attractive the different levels of facial hair in that final set of images were, so that people who just saw full beards actually rated the clean-shaven guys in the final set as far more attractive than the full-bearded guys. And the complete opposite happened when you look at the faces where they just saw all clean-shaven faces at the beginning and were rating those, and then they were presented with some bearded guys at the end. Well, they became far more attractive. If you present the even condition with that mixture of clean-shavenness, stubble, and full beards, then the preferences for clean-shaven and beardedness are pretty much identical, and that preference for stubble emerges. So that kind of somewhere in between kind of look. So we found this really nice experimental evidence for negative frequency dependent preferences for facial hair. And it complemented that historical data that Robinson got from the Illustrated London News quite nicely. And of course, at the time when we wrote this paper, there were lots of young men, part of a sociocultural movement of hipsters at the time, that were wearing full beards. And so it became kind of a kind of, yes, like in the media as being perhaps it's the end of the hipster craze and some other new style is going to come in and take over. But experimentally, there was some evidence there for that novelty for facial hair could be underpinning variations in cultural grooming patterns in order to appeal amongst crowds of other young adult males and stand out.
Yeah, I guess I'll just jump in on that. So some people in the audience might be kind of skeptical of this frequency-dependent selection thing being unique to beards. I'll just kind of throw in that plenty of other traits have been tested, and sometimes you get a frequency-dependent selection effect, and sometimes you don't, right? So some people might be thinking, oh, of course, if you stand out, you're going to get looked at longer, you're going to look better. But there have been other studies on I believe eye color was looked at, or actually it wasn't eye color, it was hair color where there was a null effect, I believe, and eye color where there was a positive effect. I apologize. So that's all just to say that it's not that being unique in general is always sexy. Right. It depends on the trait whether standing out is better than blending in.
Absolutely. We did a study on the hair color, women pictures of women with different hair colors, and we even made the lengths vary a bit, so it wasn't all obviously about hair color. So and we found a very, very strong null effect of manipulating women's hair color on frequency dependent preferences. So you can prime participants to see lots of redheads, lots of dark-haired women, and lots of blonde hair, and it doesn't make a difference as to the preferences that they report for different hair colors. So you're right, and it's not always that you get these patterns. It's not. There is one example where it appears to be the case, and that's hem lengths in women's dress. That was Nigel Barber's papers from some years ago now, and I don't know how well that replicates, but hem length seems to vary and come in and out of style. And I don't know what that means necessarily for evolutionary theory, but in terms of fashion and whatnot, there's a novelty effect there.
Yeah, exactly. I'm glad you fleshed that out on the hair color thing. I actually didn't realize you were involved in that paper. And a former mentor of mine from undergrad, she did an eye color study that did find an effect, at least in European women, where they had a strong preference for the uncommon eye color. So I completely misspoke there actually, and I was thinking of the hair color null finding. But it's all just to say that. It's all just to say that there are traits such as hair color where there doesn't seem to be a frequency dependent selection effect, and there are traits like beards and eye color and apparently hem lengths on dresses where there seems to. And so if you find it on a trait, it's an indicator that something special is going on, not an indicator that being special is what's special. If that makes any sense.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I'll give you a little prediction, and if listeners, I'd be very curious to know what they think, because I'm 41 now, so I'm out of this age bracket where this is relevance to my life. But I've noticed the frequency with which people are changing their facial shape and having minor cosmetic surgery. I wonder if that is having a frequency dependent spike, and for what reasons it's occurring. That would be something I would love to know if there's been research on that.
Yeah, that's fascinating, and it'll be interesting to see whether because frequency can also affect signal strength even when the signal isn't about attractiveness. So, like for example, tattoos. I mean, I'm covered in tattoos, and they used to have this strong countercultural signaling ability. That seems to have been, even in the last 5 years, muted substantially. And I'm guessing that if we give it another 20, maybe it won't be countercultural at all to have a tattoo. It'll become like earrings or something, where it's like some people have them, some people don't. But the signal strength is of being a rebel has been completely diluted. I guess I'm interested in other sources. I want to get back on beards for a second, because I know you've looked at other sources of variation, and I want to make sure that we hit what's been found. To review, null effect on ovulation, which is, kind of par for the course. A lot of the studies in the last 10 years have found null effects on the ovulation work. Menopause, there is an effect, but you're saying that that's that's an illusion created by the men with beards looking older and so being more, in these women's age range as a result.
Yes.
That makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
Not the pathogen stuff, a great idea, nothing there. And then the frequency stuff, a kind of an out of left field idea, but one that seems to be true.
Yep.
I'm loosely remembering, did you do something on population density as well, or city size? And then if there's any other findings on variation, before we move on to the attractiveness stuff, it would be probably good to touch those as well.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So the study that you're referring to, we again wanted to look at this frequency dependent effect, and if we at the time we did the study, there was this kind of peak of young men growing facial hair. And the question then becomes, well, why follow suit? Are there any demographic predictors of it, or any ecological or economic circumstances that might actually explain why young men are growing facial hair to the same extent as one another? Why mimic one another's grooming patterns, if you like? So we did a very large study where we went back. This was back when Facebook used to allow you to have different things that you could cull, right? You could put in, are people a certain age? Are they of, I believe, sexual orientation? You used to be able to put in. So we were able to get photographs, like profile photographs, across many different countries of men on Facebook, their preferred picture that they want everyone to see when you go onto their profile. And we did so for men from different sized cities within those countries, right? So we deliberately picked population density to vary within the countries that we looked at. And we did 100 profiles per city across, I believe it was 34 different countries, maybe more. And then we took that data and we compared it against women's preferences for facial hair, using a questionnaire that we ran online, and we matched the frequency of facial hair in the cities that we'd got from the profiles from Facebook against women's rated preferences in this study across the same areas. What we found was that facial hair among men was highest in those places where there was greater population density, so more young people packed together trying to move up the social hierarchy, I guess, an economic hierarchy, and have jobs and attract mates. Men were more bearded in those places than the less densely populated cities or towns. And then we looked at the mate preferences, and in fact, again, that the frequency to which facial hair was more profuse was highest in those cities with highest population density and lowest income. Income disparity was greater, so harder to get yourself a job and move into the kind of place you'd want to live in and settle and have a life. So that was more precarious. Economic status was more precarious, and also female choice for facial hair was higher. So it's almost like a combination of socioeconomic and demographic factors conspire alongside female preferences for facial hair to predict the amount of facial hair that you'll see cross-culturally. And these are in, the kind of, as I say, they're cities, densely populated cities, so they're not representative of the entire world or small-scale societies, but nonetheless, it would suggest that signaling sexual maturity and masculinity through facial hair was prioritized in more densely populated settings with more conspecifics around to compete for economic resources and also to compete for mates. So that was kind of a really, really neat finding, I thought.
Yeah, that is very neat. And I think it's going to relate more to our discussion of the male-male direct competition side of facial hair, just because, income inequality it's a proxy for mating market intensity, right? If there's more stratification between males, right? If some men are millionaires and some men are homeless, well then, competing, suddenly it matters. But if everyone's making $20 an hour, then it doesn't really, well, why compete at all? There's not much to be won or lost. So that's one thing. And then obviously, if we're looking at density, that means or city size, that means more competitors per square mile, right? That's another potential proxy for male competition intensity. I would like to ask, while we're on the topic of attractiveness in general, it seems that there's this effect of frequency on attractiveness that doesn't seem to tell a particularly persuasive story of beards evolving via that route, right? It might be part of the story, but it doesn't leave me walking away saying, oh, that's why beards evolved, because when they're uncommon, they're sexy. That doesn't really work for me.
Yep.
I guess one thing to throw in here, and it's pretty closely related to beards and very closely related to work that you've published. What about facial masculinity generally, right? So masculine facial traits other than beards. Are those attractive? And how does facial masculinity interface with the findings that we see on beards?
No, that's absolutely right. And with regards to attractiveness, I've looked at that too, and it's been something that it's a logical thing to compare with facial hair, because of course facial hair grows on around those regions that you would typically define as facially masculine. So as with other bodily traits, men and women on average differ in several androgen dependent characteristics, notably jaw size, brow ridge depth, which then influences somewhat narrower eyes, or at least the appearance of narrower eyes. And then a wider bizygomatic width, which is your cheekbones. Now, there are various studies out there claiming that one component of these measures is more important than the other. I'm going to sidestep that for a minute and just say that looking at these sexually dimorphic masculine facial features has preoccupied a lot of research. And really, my stuff borrowed heavily from that, the facial hair research. And part of the reason I got into doing facial hair research was because I wanted to do some facial shape research, masculinity stuff. And every time I read a paper that they'd written, they'd put in the methods, only clean-shaven faces were used because facial hair's a confound. And everyone's terrified of confounds, obviously, in their experiments. Someone's going to pull apart their theory and their data, because, of course, how could you ever claim something like that when, you're confounded for facial hair? So that piqued my interest, and I thought, well, actually, facial hair is more sexually dimorphic than facial shape, and so I'm going to look at that. But to bring it back to the facial masculinity literature, well, yes, there are studies showing that more masculine-looking guys are judged as more sexually mature, more masculine, obviously, than less facially masculine guys, and especially when you show the same guy morph to appear more or less masculine. That's a very popular way of pulling out this effect quickly and easily and replicably. The attractiveness question is just as variable as the beardedness research that I've done. I mean, and in fact, my research drew heavily on that literature. And, in some contexts, facial masculinity might be more attractive. And some of these hypotheses that I mentioned earlier, like the ovulatory shift and the changes in hormone levels, were argued initially, and this is not for a small period of time, for well over a decade. This was the dominant accepted theory that women shift their preferences when they're more fertile towards masculine-looking guys, because those masculine guys could be delivering the good genes. And as I mentioned, those hypotheses around pathogens, but also the Volstad and Carter's immunocompetence hypothesis was that testosterone lowers immune function. So therefore, if you have a testosterone or androgen-dependent trait, like facial masculinity relies on androgens for its expression, and it appears in adolescence and fully developed at adulthood. So, that would communicate viability, but also communicate the ability to withstand the negative impact of testosterone on the immune system, hence delivering better genetic quality to offspring. And if there is female choice or choosiness around that trait, presumably masculinity is going to be more attractive when being choosy would be highly beneficial. And, as you mentioned earlier, these studies, and me included, trying to replicate, I've never replicated those things. And there's been lots of debate surrounding why this is the case, and it's basically my take on it that this ovulatory shift effect isn't as strong, anywhere near as strong as the initial studies that first reported it, and there are others out there, I would imagine, that would have a stronger statement regarding whether it's even a relevant mechanism underpinning variation in women's mate choice. But nonetheless, facial masculinity is interesting, and facial hair is interesting as well, because it can do one of two things to a face that varies in underlying masculinity. On the one hand, it can make a masculine face look more masculine. It's like dialing up the masculinityometer by adding this big chunk of hair on top of your already big jaw and emphasizing your brow ridge because your eyes are going to be drawn up to other features, and even maybe making the bizygomatic width of the face greater. So that would be one thing. So you could be very, very, very masculine looking by being, craniofacially masculine and adorning that with a full beard. The alternative is that it could provide an advantage to very, if for want of a better word, feminine looking men. They could actually dial up their masculinity to a level that would be preferred under whatever circumstances socioculturally, and mask those characteristics that are perhaps less mature looking in the face. So if you do have a what you'd call a gracile chin, delicate features, if you want to call it that, then perhaps you could embellish upon those with masculinity through growing facial hair. And that's kind of where I got interested in that, because why not test that as a hypothesis? Like, it might not be that being the most masculine looking individual is attractive all the time, but there's variation here in two traits. So I did a study where we looked at the clean-shaven, light stubble, heavy stubble, and full bearded faces on a sample of men, natural faces that I'd collected photographs of, and then we morphed the faces to look more or less masculine. So you had these sort of feminized versions and masculinized versions of all the different degrees of facial hair. And the results were quite, interesting in that the completely masculine looking guy did drop off in appeal, because it's like just perhaps too much masculinity to have, this big jaw with a beard on it and, super masculine facial features embellished with the facial hair. But the faces that were judged to be more attractive with facial hair were those much more feminine looking faces. And somewhere in the middle for the most attractiveness was combination of masculinity and femininity and stubble. So there was definitely, well, we interpreted it in the paper as perhaps there's a masking effect of faces that make a man look younger. One of the easiest, if you follow the classic David Buss kind of studies, one of the easiest studies to replicate might be that women prefer a partner who's somewhat older than them. I'm not saying 20 years older, 3 to 5 years perhaps. And facial hair, one of the things it does, and I haven't mentioned this so far, and it's not surprising at all, but it increases perceived age. So a man who's 25 and grows a full beard probably would be rated as looking 28 or 29, maybe even 30. So age and maturity are enhanced by facial hair. And if you have a face that, as I say, for want of a better word, doesn't look as mature as a masculine face, the feminized looking individual, they get more of a boost in attractiveness by having facial hair as this kind of badge of masculinity and age and sexual maturity and hence viability.
Oh, fascinating. All right. Well, I guess I've got two immediate thoughts on that. The first, and I haven't read this paper that you're referring to. I will after our call. The first thought that I'm having is the recent conclusion in the kind of summary of like what's attractive in the most recent Oxford Handbook of Evolutionary Psychology and Romantic Relationships, where they basically said slightly feminine male faces are generally more attractive, and more masculine than average bodies are more attractive, which again kind of goes to the blended thing where it's like it seems that some combination of femininity and masculinity is coming out better. But I think the masking story is a better one, and it reminds me of something that maybe you've already looked into or would want to look into in the future, perhaps. online there's this term called beard fishing, right? I don't know if you've heard it, where so it's a derivative of catfishing, and it's referring to men who are facially unattractive but hide that using a big beard. So this makes some sense. We've already talked about contour, shape change, but also a beard creates the illusion. A good beard will create the illusion of symmetry where there's no symmetry, right?
Yeah.
It can hide facial and neck fat and even create the illusion of a jawline. It hides skin imperfections. So someone with very bad skin could hide 2/3 of their face in some cases with a big enough beard and a baseball cap, right? And so if you look at beards as cover up, it could be that just in general there's an attraction effect where, if you're a very handsome man, right? If you're Ryan Gosling, well, growing a beard is going to hide what you actually have to work with. But if you're, if you're, I'm not going to list an ugly actor. I'm not going to call someone out, but I almost did. If you hide most of your face, I don't know. Is there any work on that on beards not being more attractive, but maybe making you less ugly?
That I've never done that study, but that's essentially my take on it. Is that, and even the other day I was talking to a friend of mine, and she was telling me, about her husband, and she's just a little younger than me, but the husband's a little older than me, and she was saying, when I first met him, and you'll see in our wedding picture, she was showing me her wedding pictures, and she said, you'll see he's got this like hanging bit under his neck. I was like, what? And she goes, a bit of kind of like floppy skin underneath his neck. I hate it, so I make him grow facial hair. And I was like, oh, okay. And then she showed me the picture, and I was like, oh, I see what you mean. Like, I, as a straight man, heterosexual man, I wasn't really particularly one way or the other. I just was like, oh, that's him clean shaven. But after she pointed it out, I was like, I see what you mean. And I think this thing that you've just mentioned of beard fishing, that's fascinating. I mean, this idea that you're cheating your potential future dates, if you like, by masking who you really are underneath your facial hair. That's essentially what I think might be happening with the attractiveness of facial hair, particularly among your heavier set guys, where they might not have a jawline or something like that, and they can mimic that jawline effect by grooming their facial hair. If they're able to grow, that amount of stubble into facial hair, then that could work to their advantage. And the masking effects to not disguise. I think the beard fishing thing's funny because it makes it sound like guys are
malicious, right?
Yeah, they've got this some like evil plan to.
they're eventually going to shave and reveal. Yeah,
yeah, it's like, yeah, but it is something that points to this idea of an ornament that covers up, as you say, some perhaps imperfections in the skin and lack of jawline, and may give the face shape that will give it higher attractiveness than if they didn't have that. And as you say, if somebody happens to be blessed with these great good looks, like your actors out there, Ryan Gosling and so forth, like, hey, maybe that embellishment of the facial hair is just, it's not required. You've got the looks already. You've got the jawline that people like, and the parameters of the eyes relative to that jawline and brow ridge and etc. that isn't too full on and just about right to be appealing in terms of beauty or handsomeness. You're right. It could just be that beards reduce, for want of a better word, lower attractiveness. They boost it up to that level where an unattractive face, because of the reasons we've just been talking about, might be enhanced and brought up to a level of satisfactory attractiveness. I'm going to look into this beard fishing thing because that's just piqued my interest. But no, I think it follows with what I was talking about quite nicely.
It definitely does dovetail. If you ever are interested, maybe later this year or early next year, I think it would be a pretty easy study to run, and we could potentially use data you've already collected. So one thing that you could do, or potentially if you want some help on it, is we could get ratings for the clean on data sets where you already have the attractiveness effects of beards. You could get ratings of the attractiveness of all the clean shaven faces, and then the prediction of this hypothesis that beard fishing is part of the story here, and maybe it's not. It's this is totally speculative at this point. But if it's part of it, then you would expect that the clean shaven faces that are less attractive will become less unattractive when they grow a beard. And the clean shaven faces that are more attractive will become less attractive when they grow a beard. Basically, it's creating, it's and maybe there's, I know that some people have already done studies on COVID masks and attractiveness, and how it seems to dampen the extremes, and maybe beards, a beard is nature's COVID mask. So
No, it's funny you say that because, at the height of the pandemic, I've got two pretty young children, and at the time one of them was basically a baby and the other one was a very young toddler. And so those papers came out and I was like, that's what I've been thinking about with facial hair. And I'm just now feeling more back to my regular self in terms of work and coming up with ideas. And I'd love to work on that project, and it would be super easy to do. And all you'd need to do, I would probably do a new study with all the faces that I have access to in my set, and give have a midpoint of the scale be 0, it's like a neutral, and then have people go down, as in less attractive, to -50, and then attractive to +50, and then you could see how the individual variation fluctuates as a function of facial hair. And I would go, on record unofficially as saying, I think what you're suggesting there might actually happen. That would be a fairly strong inkling of mine. It's not not making you super attractive, but it might dampen the unattractiveness of the face for sure. I'm thinking that's a legit way of looking at it.
Yeah, I'd also expect it to dampen attractiveness, frankly, because just looking, when I think of, okay, who are the male heartthrobs? It's not guys with big bushy beards, and the only exception is that I can think of just off the top of my head is the musical artist Drake. And he is a classic example, on let's call it the gray literature. I'm referring to TikTok of he'd be a classic example of beard fishing, stereotypically, of like, oh, he didn't have much of a jaw, maybe he had naturally kind of a more fat on his face. Again, nothing wrong with that, but it's just not what's necessarily appealing. He grows this big beard, and suddenly, he's hot stuff. I don't know if you're interested in getting me involved in this. I would happily do a bunch of grunt work to help you out, but we'll talk about that over email maybe.
Yes.
Okay, so I guess with to look at facial masculinity, right?
Yep.
Facial hair. We're getting this. I'm getting this picture that it seems to be about neutral, right? It doesn't seem like there's a strong preference either way. And there are these contexts that make it more or less attractive, right? Mm-hmm. To have facial hair, and maybe to be facially masculine as well, although we didn't really get into that.
Yeah.
But it doesn't seem that the, attracting girls part of the scenario or attracting women part of the scenario, that doesn't seem to be what's happening with the hair on our faces.
I would agree with that.
I think it would be good then to pivot to where we see stronger effects. So I've read again quite a bit of your work on beards, and the overall impression I'm getting, right, from the anger, the dominance, the age, all this stuff, is that beards are quite intimidating. Is that an accurate interpretation overall, or have I read too much?
No. So back to the beginning of our discussion when I said was telling you about the first paper I ever wrote on facial hair, which was I was working in Samoa and doing my PhD in New Zealand. The clean-shaven faces were more attractive, and that kind of made me think I'd found some clear result when the broader literature just led me down this path of, looking at nuanced effects. The other clear result I found in both cultures was that social status or dominance in the same category, and it was much higher for bearded than clean-shaven faces. And that was men and women in both cultures that had strong agreement on that. And then I also asked men to look at the faces of, in Samoa, Polynesian faces, and in New Zealand, European faces, with and without facial hair, but posing now angry faces. And it seemed to me at the time, the reason I did the study was, if facial hair is involved in sociosexual signaling to women and men, and this is in some way sexually selected, you might expect it to embellish upon those facial expressions used in nonverbal communication or in concert with verbal communication to enhance perceived anger and aggressiveness and threat. And if you go down that path of male-male signaling or intrasexual competition, as the classic Darwinian terms for it, then perhaps facial hair kind of embellishes upon those threatening facial expressions. And that's what I found in both Samoa and New Zealand, was that having an angry face with a full beard was far more threatening looking than that same male photographed clean shaven and doing the angry facial expression. And to be honest, looking back on it in 2012 when that paper came out, I went down the kind of path of looking at the attractiveness question for many years, and I kind of circled back to the male-male competition stuff because I was like, wait a minute, why have I not pursued this question a bit more? And I did a series of studies where we looked at implicit reaction times and accuracy of assigning facial expressions, so smiling or happy and angry or threatening facial expressions with and without facial hair, and participants, and sad facial expressions too, just have another negative, if you like, facial expression that's not involved in threat, to see if it's not just recognition of threatening faces, but it could just be that these are negative facial expressions and beards enhance negative facial expressions more than positive ones or pro-social ones like smiling. And we did these studies. I worked with Belinda Craig, who's much more of a cognitive neurotype researcher than me. And we looked at reaction times and accuracy of assigning the correct facial expression to the one they were looking at with bearded and clean-shaven faces. And participants were faster and more accurate to assign anger to a bearded face than a clean-shaven face. They were faster to assign smiles to a clean-shaven than a bearded face. And the effect wasn't due to it being a negative facial expression like sadness, because they weren't faster to assign sadness to the bearded face than the clean-shaven face. And that paper was published in 2019, I want to say. And I then followed up and did a second study with Belinda on that, where we looked at stubble. Is it a linear effect? So is an angry clean-shaven face recognized slower than a stubbled bearded face? And these are the angry facial expressions. And then the quickest would be the full bearded. And we actually found this linear pattern for how fast and accurately people identified threatening facial expressions in male faces when there were beards of increasing size added to the face. So I really think that it's a explicit thing, like men explicitly rank males as looking more threatening and more masculine and dominant when they see a fully bearded face compared to a clean shaven. And also it comes out in sociosexual signaling through nonverbal facial expressions of emotion. I then did another study circling back to the question of facial masculinity, and I thought, well, if it's really intrasexually selected, like male-male signaling here, I wonder if those males that are, less masculine looking, and I should mention facial masculinity correlates with upper body strength and muscle, and so it does provide a window into the kind of underlying physique of the individual that you might be assessing as a potential rival. Let's say you're getting in an argument with somebody and you're just looking face to face. Those masculine guys probably have broader shoulders and are a bit stronger potentially than less masculine guys.
And just to ask a quick question about signals such as that, do we know whether it's that we've evolved perceptual abilities to detect cues to strengthen the face, or is that the face has evolved to signal the underlying quality, or what's the interpretation there generally?
So my take on it is that you can, from the literature, cues of upper body strength are present in just assessing faces. So it could be that the face provides, that's where we look at with each other. It's what we take photographs of and put on our walls. We don't put photographs of each other's shoulders. You know, we put faces up there, and it can provide a somewhat accurate window into the physical, I guess, formidability in the case of masculinity. So a more masculine face more likely will belong to a guy with broader shoulders. I have a paper that just came out on that in Biology Letters with Neil Caton, my former PhD student, where we looked at in 6,000 plus men and women's faces, and we looked at principal components of physique, and we had a principal component which related to upper body measures like, you know, broad shoulders, thicker circumferences of the arm, and all these other characteristics that broadly would speak to sexual dimorphism in muscularity and physique. And that was the strongest predictor, strongest association, with the bizygomatic width and masculinity, for want of another word. So there is some evidence for that, and that's not the only paper, but just because that was recently published in Biology Letters, it comes to mind. So I think it's that faces do provide, in this case, some indication of accuracy regarding the formidability physically of a potential rival. So I took that question, much like the attractiveness stuff that we were talking about earlier on, and I thought, well, what if you don't have a particularly formidable face and you're, you know, having a agonistic encounter with somebody or a disagreement, or you're just trying to get your point across? Does the facial hair do anything to augment perceptions of masculinity, social dominance, and physical aggressiveness? And I did a study on this where we took faces that were clean shaven and bearded, and I morphed them with my collaborators to be super feminine looking, somewhat feminine looking, neutral, somewhat masculine, and very masculine on clean shaven and bearded faces. And what we found for those ratings was that obviously you do get a very large effect of just beards on their own. But when you look at the interaction between the degree of facial masculinity and clean shaven versus beardedness, an absolutely fascinating thing emerged, which was that the face that was morphed to look really, really feminine with facial hair was ranked as significantly more significantly more masculine, dominant, and aggressive compared to the clean-shaven, hyper-masculine-looking face. Okay. And these the effect sizes ranged from, you know, medium to large as well. They weren't just trivial effect sizes.
That's incredible. So what we're looking at here is that facial masculinity, just so I make sure I'm following what you're saying. Yeah. Facial masculinity is an honest cue to formidability, right? And that translates, or it seems to be, and that translates to perceptions of increased dominance, aggressiveness, easier, maybe anger perception, that sort of thing, right? Those sorts of findings when we look at a masculine face. And the same thing is true for beards, but even more so, right? We perceive them as more dominant, aggressive. But I've read you call beards and maybe this wasn't your writing, obviously multiple authors, a dishonest signal of formidability. So are you implying that while masculine faces actually are, right? Like, so I guess what I'm saying is masculine faces look scarier, and they actually are scary because masculine faced men are more dangerous on average. Beards are scarier, right? They look scarier, but they aren't actually scary because there's no underlying truth to the promise. And yet the signal is stronger still. Am I following what's happening?
I think that's about right, in my opinion. And with getting a little bit into the biology of facial hair is important here. And the traits that we're talking about, like muscularity and I believe craniofacial masculinity, they rely for testosterone on their development. Facial hair undergoes a different process, and it's a little bit complicated, but I'll just throw it out there for the audience to digest. And that is that you can pump somebody full of testosterone and they will grow facial hair, but they'll only grow facial hair to the degree to which they're genetically capable to grow it. And what I mean by that is testosterone is converted into another form of androgen called dihydrotestosterone within the hair follicle, right? and that it requires a enzyme activity called 5-alpha reductase 2 for it to grow. So if you pump somebody full of testosterone, the only way it's going to turn testosterone to dihydrotestosterone is having the genetic capability to transform that hormone into the necessary hormone through that 5-alpha reductase 2 deficiency. 5-alpha reductase 2 activity. And we know this because of there are a cluster of males identified in a handful of populations around the world, one in Papua New Guinea, for instance, of men born with 5-alpha reductase 2 deficiency. It's just a genetic abnormality, if you like, and they're unable to grow body hair, facial hair, or pubic hair. And this is because they lack that enzyme capability to transform testosterone to dihydrotestosterone. But interestingly, they're taller, if not taller on average, and they're muscular and all these other characteristics that rely on testosterone alone for their expression. So the reason why I'm saying it's potentially a dishonest thing is because it doesn't correlate directly with the expression of other androgen-dependent traits that are linked to physique. And it doesn't share what you'd call an allometric relationship with other parts of physique that I mentioned. So if you have a more masculine face, then it shares allometry. The traits correlate with other parts of the body that are bigger and more masculine looking, whereas facial hair goes through a different biological mechanism for its expression. And I know that that's quite a lot to digest, perhaps for people that aren't familiar with how androgens work during ontogeny and into puberty and into adulthood. But the way I've been thinking about it has been with that in mind, in order to understand its signaling role. It can't do anything to actually accurately display to another male that you're actually able to outdo them physically. What I would suggest instead is that it has a very rapid, quick effect that it induces in somebody looking at you, which makes you go, this is another male getting angry. I'm understanding that very rapidly, and that might curtail some of these agonistic confrontations. That would be an interesting study to do, because I believe that, barring the world of something like MMA or something like that, it's not like you want to get into a fight too often. It's costly. So if an ornament actually embellishes you beyond what is perhaps accurate, then it might help to curtail agonistic confrontations from escalating.
Yeah, of course. And so much of, male competition is bluffing and actually successfully interpreting, the signals that someone could be dangerous so that you don't have to fight, right? The only point of perceiving danger is so you can avoid it. So that makes perfect sense to me. So I guess I want to talk more about fighting to map some of this out. It sounds like you're saying that, and I'm going to try to summarize some of the complex testosterone and hormonal literature that you just shared, is that facial masculinity is scary and it's an accurate cue to physical strength, because facial masculinity is predicted by testosterone, which also predicts, strength, broadness, those sorts of things that are genuinely something to worry about if someone gets a hold of you.
Yeah.
Beards, however, there's this disconnect where it's like, yes, you need testosterone to start the process, but there's no linear relationship between the amount of testosterone you have and the amount of beard display signal you can produce, because there's this middleman here of, your genetic ability to convert alpha reductase. I believe you said
alpha reductase.
To basically to make the beard happen. I guess the mechanism doesn't really make sense. That makes perfect sense to me, right? And then the reason that beards work as a signal is because they translate the information. I'm an angry man, right? They translate that information quicker. Another potential signaling function as it relates to violence. When I grew up, right, when I was a teenager and a young adult, I was an amateur boxer, and that was my main sport. And I remember they used to make us shave our facial hair right before fights, right? They literally, if you showed up with even a mustache, right, they'd be like, hey, that's going to act as a cushion. You have to shave it, right? And whether that's true or not, I don't know. But in pro boxing, right, it happens as well, where, if one fighter has a big, bushy Drake-style beard, then, the opponent will have the option at least to complain and say, hey, that beard could be a cushion, right? Because it's going to be harder to knock this guy out if he's got, a pillow attached to his face. And I guess that kind of adds some. I mean, boxing officials, everyone could just be wrong about beards working. But some evolutionary theorists have, thrown this out there. They've been like, look, in other animals, we see, things like increased hair around the neck, right, to defend against bites to the neck, since that's, a cheap way of cushioning the body, to just be like, oh, we'll just grow hair. And it's also a regenerative way to cushion the body, right? If it gets damaged, if this defensive architecture gets damaged, well, it grows back pretty quickly. So I guess with all that context kind of in the air, do you think there's any possibility that the reason I'm more intimidated by a guy with a beard, let's say, is because something in my apish brain is like, look, if I hit this guy, it's not going to work as well?
Oh, that's absolutely a theory that's been put out there. There was a paper that I read years ago by, I've forgotten her first name, Blanchard, and she's an endocrinologist, and she compared the human beard to a lion's mane, and she argued that the lion's mane did exactly what you just described. It provides a regenerative, protective organ that can, make male lions, because male lions do fight, and it's rough and it's costly and all that. And they also have harem defense polygyny, I believe. So they've got other females in their group that this other male might be trying to come in and take over and get rid of the babies and start his own reproductive career there. So it made sense logically, that argument. I'll get back to it in a minute. But she then said the same analogy for human facial hair. So I thought, well, that's an interesting hypothesis, and I thought I'd test it. And as you mentioned, for boxing, there's rules, right? People should shave, and by the sounds of what you were saying, it's somewhat optional to shave or not shave. But if
in the pros it's optional, but if you're competing in USA boxing, which is the main amateur system, you couldn't do even the lowest level of the Golden Gloves. There'd be a guy there being like, hey, shave your face.
Yep. So that's definitely what I'd kind of heard, and so I avoided the boxing data for that reason. But interestingly, in the UFC, the Ultimate Fighting Championship, which, to be honest with you, I can't really watch it. It's the equivalent of putting ants in a jar and shaking them up, to me. Like, you put people in this confined space, and they're just, the most extreme types of fighters, and it's difficult to watch if you've got a sensitive stomach, basically, because they really beat each other, right, and grapple each other in the most full-on ways. But one thing they do allow you to do is to grow facial hair. So I thought, well, why not go through all the records of fights, look who won and look how they won, knockout or submissions and all that kind of stuff, and go back to the actual photographs of the fight and try and get a sense of whether or not they had a big, full, bushy beard or not. And then you could see whether or not there is, in fact, a protective function in a real one-on-one classic contest competition kind of scenario where anything goes, because it's mixed fighting. It's not like it's just boxing or it's MMA, right? Mixed martial arts. So there's going to be people in there that are going to box someone to knock out, and there are going to be people that do other grappling techniques. And there's another hypothesis that's built into that, this time not from Blanchard, but from Zahavi and Zahavi, where they thought that facial hair actually could be a handicap in a fight, because if you allow it to grow, and by the way, facial hair keeps growing until really it stops naturally, which, can be many meters long. The World Beard Championships, you can see guys with beards that are meters long, right? Perhaps that's a handicap in a fight, because be like the equivalent of, grabbing someone's ponytail and pulling them back to get an advantage, or you could grab their beard and pull them towards you. It hurts, throws you off and you could hit them. So I tested these two hypotheses, right? Competing hypotheses. And I found absolutely no evidence at all for beards either being something that was advantageous in terms of not getting knocked out, or something that was bad or not non-advantageous in terms of being something that could be grabbed and pulled and you're more likely to be knocked out perhaps if you have a beard. So I found absolutely no evidence for the hypothesis that beards perform a protective function or that they're a handicap using this MMA data that we generated.
Yeah, and I think that there's going to be some skepticism about the MMA data. I'll just throw out that you did find an effect for facial width to height ratio, which is, I believe, a component of facial masculinity. That was associated with MMA success. Yes. For some of the reasons that you mentioned earlier. So it is possible. It's not that the methodology that that you've chosen, can't find stuff here. There's something to be said for it. I will just throw out, I spoke to someone at a conference about this, UFC research, which I won't say is trendy, right? It's not particularly popular, but you're not the only one who's done it. It's something that's, it's my way of saying that this is, people who are interested in male fighting have liked to play with it as a bit of a laboratory here. And, I heard a criticism of it that I'd just like you to briefly weigh in on. I'm not realizing that's a UFC or boxing analogy in itself. Is that selection has already happened on this population for fighting ability? So it's like you're looking at a population where it's not everyone out in the world, right? Yeah. It's the best fighters in the world who have already gone through the selection filter of being winners, right? And so you're looking at a population of winners and seeing how they do against each other, but maybe in the real world, right, with people who aren't, lifetime trained strikers, right? Maybe I guess I'll put this out here, right? Like just looking at facial hair. I'm not saying that I support this hypothesis. I'm kind of playing devil's advocate, but looking at facial hair, it's most thick around the exact places that you aim for when you're trying to knock someone out. And it's also thick around, the worst place to get punched, hypothetically, which would be the throat, right? Yeah. So it's literally guarding, if it was a shield, it's in the perfect location, right? Okay. And then with a knockout, there's surely, going to be a bit of a threshold here where it's like, if you get hit clean by a UFC fighter, it doesn't really matter whether you have a beard or not. But if you get hit by, random Joe Schmo at the bar, maybe 2 inches of facial hair, actually, maybe that's the difference maker. Maybe that's the difference between you going to sleep and you being, I don't know. Is there any consideration of that?
No, those are completely legitimate criticisms of this area of research and totally legitimate ideas for future stuff. I'm always one of these people like, hey, if it's wrong or it's not been done completely, then I'm more than happy to entertain different data that gives a better insight into it. And as you point out, there is, it's not like everyone's running around doing MMA research, but in evolutionary psych or whatever, but it provides a chance to look at effects within that kind of contest competition realm. And again, it's this idea of, well, where does selection operate properly on traits? Does it operate around the midpoint of the distribution of those traits, like your typical average guy in the bar, as we're talking about, that otherwise isn't going around and going into his office at work, closing the door and saying, right, I've got a beef with my colleague, this is now our MMA cage, let's have a fight. But maybe selection on these fighting abilities does operate on those extreme ends of the distributions, right? That would be the same for, say, personality traits, men and women, for instance, not massively different on narcissism and all these other traits. But if you look at the ends of the distribution, you get those people that are very high in those traits, and they tend to be, con men and, people that do abhorrent things within society. Perhaps these are just representative of the tail ends of the distribution. And that's interesting in of itself, because you've now got people that are extreme in these characteristics, but it's also problematic in the ways that you've pointed out as being criticisms of the study, in that, look, if an MMA guy spin kicks you in the head, you're going down, whether you're a pro or especially if you're not a pro. It's just that level of physical strength, accuracy, and formidability in this very, very unusually intense environment that 99.9% of us literally wouldn't ever go into. So in a bar, I mean, let's pretend it's not a bar with alcohol, because alcohol kind of changes the whole landscape here. If it was just a situation where people were sober and went in and had a fight, and in fact, one of the places that this might be worth doing would be, say, bare knuckle boxing as another alternative sporting avenue, because it's semi-professional and they don't protect themselves, and they may well vary in their beardedness, and you could look at perhaps in more detail some of the fighting outcomes that are more nuanced than just knockouts. It could be scrapes, abrasions, cuts. Perhaps it masks or protects against other things beyond just the knockout. But I think it's a fair criticism to say that these MMA data sets that we're using do represent those extreme ends of the distribution, which, like I say, it's a double-edged thing here. It means, well, it's really interesting to study people at those ends of the distribution, but then it's also not typical of what you would find in everyday life. And so, as we all know, sexual selection operates on variation within and between populations, and looking just at the extremes is very limited. But it does provide at least a test of some of these hypotheses moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, it is. I think it is a test. I mean, that's the thing, is that it's a source of potential evidence. And if you had found, I mean, it's very easy to criticize ex post facto, but the reality is that you did find an effect with the facial width to height ratio, which is proof of method being able to find effects, right? And then second, if you had come on the podcast and said, actually, men with big bushy beards were less likely to get knocked out, well, then I wouldn't have said, none of those criticisms would have come up. So it's one of those things where it's like, I mean, it probably is true that the Australopithecines weren't throwing spinning back kicks to each other's chins. It probably was more sloppy strikes where maybe a beard could actually act as a shield. But, then again, it's I don't know. It would be interesting. It would be interesting to know whether, UFC fighters as a population are more likely to be bearded than just, accountants.
Yeah.
It would be a good test in the sense that if you found an effect, it would say maybe something's happening, but it's not a great test in the sense that like a null effect isn't a super strong rejection the way it would be with like the ovulation studies, where it's like you found a null effect and it's like, oh, there really is nothing there. It's like it's still kind of maybe, but not definitely situation. Okay, well, we've covered a lot here, and we've certainly ticked the boxes that I wanted to tick. I mean, I guess I'll just because I'm gonna act as as the listener here, and I know that a lot of this podcast is just me repeating what you say back to you, but it's really to make sure that I'm not misunderstanding. Because if I'm misunderstanding, then I'd guess at least a third of the audience probably is as well. The picture that I'm getting here, right, is that, beards have some impact on attractiveness in some scenarios, but the big effects really are on intimidation, right? But those intimidation effects are dishonest. And so, from a speculative point of view or informed speculation point of view, beards are evolved as a dishonest ornament to signal masculine threat.
I think that's definitely a big part of it. And I would say that the things that it definitely does communicate unambiguously is, and this is again, there are cross-cultural variation in beard thickness. I mean, we're in Australia, and I work in the Pacific Islands with Melanesian populations like Papua New Guinea, Vanuatu. I do a lot of work in Vanuatu. Melanesian guys grow very, very big, thick beards. But if you go, say, across to Polynesia, Samoa, Tonga, they don't grow the same profuseness of beards. So there is cross-cultural variation, and that's a whole other set of questions. But broadly speaking, facial hair unambiguously says that you're a biological male, right? And you have circulating levels of testosterone that permit you to grow this trait. it's complicated, the mechanism, but that's a basic tenet. That you're older because it happens later in puberty, and so therefore, as you're getting fuller facial hair and you're entering young adulthood and you're sexually mature, that's one thing that it can definitely communicate, and that you're actually holding adult status, so you're viable as a mate as well. So it does communicate some pretty basic things accurately, and that would be if everyone around the world just allowed themselves to grow facial hair to its natural levels, that you're old enough, sexually mature, viable as a mate, and then the attractiveness stuff, when beards are attractive, just for people in the world of psych who are listening and know about effect sizes, typically you get an effect size, if it's in the direction of beards being attractive, between 0.1 something to 0.2 something. They're very small effect sizes, whereas for the judgments of masculinity, dominance, and aggressiveness, they tend to be medium to large. So even when you have them in the direction that would suggest beards are attractive, that in a study, they tend to be pretty small effect sizes. And so back to the threat side of things, it doesn't communicate biological honesty, that you're actually more physically formidable. It's a badge of status, an ornament that communicates, as I say, some aspects of sexual and social maturity to some extent, but it's not an honest signal of physical formidability.
Fascinating. That's a great summary, and I guess it's worth just touching on briefly, because I think a lot of people, including myself, are going to be, left slightly confused as to how it's possible that a beard signals status, age, right, and sexually mature male biology, but doesn't lead to increased attraction. Like, I can't think of one other trait that would make me seem like, if I could press a button and say, I want to be 10% more dominant, seem, 10% higher status and 10% more obviously male, right? I would expect that after I press that button, I'd be more attractive to women, right? So how could it be the case that beards offer all of these positive masculine associations, and then when you actually ask women, like, hey, who's the sexiest guy in this photo set, the answer is maybe that bearded guy, or maybe this clean shaven guy, and it doesn't seem to come out as an effect. Why would that be the case?
Well, I think that question is baffled me for a long time, and I did do a study recently, a couple of years ago now, but it's relatively recent, where I think I got somewhere close to an answer to this. Again, small effect sizes, but I asked women who were not pregnant, I believe it was not pregnant, currently pregnant, and had young children, what they found appealing and not appealing in facial hair. I asked them a bunch of questions, things like masculinity, dominance, sexual attractiveness, and then parental investment and nurturance, right? And what happened was, if you look at women who don't have children and are young and probably basing a lot of preferences on, as is natural with people looking at what they find attractive, the pure aesthetics, which, as we're talking about, is variable when it comes to facial hair preferences, then clean shaven faces were judged as more sexually attractive by them compared to the women that have children under the age of 1, so nursing infants. However, the opposite result, and the effect size was a bit larger for this, was that they both groups judged beards as looking dominant and masculine, as in all the other studies that I think I've pretty much read or contributed myself. But one thing that they did differ on was the extent to which there would be parental investment, like nurturance and caring. And there's something going on there with facial hair, because in that regard, because the mothers with young infants were rating them as higher on that dimension, significantly higher, with a smallish to medium-ish effect size. I believe it was in the small range, Cohen's D effect size, but nonetheless it was present compared to the women that didn't have children at all, nulliparous women, you would call them in the literature. And so it could be that it matters in the domain or dimension of mating psychology. And it could be that those masculine cues and slight level of dominance there, we're not talking about interpartner violence here, we're talking about somebody who holds status and can provide, but also has some nurturing qualities too, because that's part of being a father as well, as caring and nurturing for infants. That emerged as a significant finding that I think is worth probing in the future. And it might be part of a suite of traits. So it may be that clean-shaven guys, as you mentioned earlier in the current volume of Encyclopedia of Evolutionary Psychology, where they talk about, somewhat less masculine faces, but a strong muscular physique is kind of what's considered in the literature at the moment to be identified as the preferred traits in a male. Well, postpartum, when you're looking for an investing partner, muscularity may be of less importance. And, there's a phenomenon of the dad bod emerging, as people are telling me about a lot, where, having a slightly plumper body is actually indicative of nurturing capabilities. Well, perhaps that in concert with a full beard might actually be attractive because it's sort of a more homely, nurturing overall appearance than, say, a clean-shaven guy with a buff body who, might aesthetically and even in some sense be displaying aspects of genetic quality, whereas less muscle and more facial hair might be communicating the more nurturing, investing side. And I think when you look at a species like human beings, we are unusual in many ways compared to the non-human primates, right back to how we started this discussion. But we do have biparental care, but a high degree of sexual dimorphism. And that's unusual. And we also form long-term bonds and reproduce. So we have these unusual features that, as much as it's amazing to draw on comparative studies across primates and mammals in general, there are some standout things. And I think this area of long-term partner formation and child rearing might provide some of those answers to the conundrum surrounding aesthetics and sexual attractiveness of facial hair.
I really don't want to keep you for another 2 hours, but I am interested on this point because the parenting finding is just fascinating because it really. So there's this very coherent story, right, that's been told in evolutionary psychology and to a lesser extent in behavioral ecology that gets told across undergraduate classrooms that are, studying this topic. And it's this idea of, masculinity trade-offs, sometimes masculinity paradoxes, where, and it's very coherent. It's a story that makes sense to everyone the first time they hear it. It's like, look, as a woman, on the one hand, you want signals of good genes, right? And masculinity, your ability of your body to withstand, these high doses of testosterone, et cetera, your ability to develop robustly, which is, correlated with all these things such as provisioning and defensive abilities. You want all those traits, right? On the one hand, because you're going to have fitter, safer offspring. But then on the other hand, right, guys who have those traits, because, they're so sexy, they're going to be able to have affairs and they might be more likely to mistreat you, right? They might, if they have higher testosterone, they might be more aggressive to you. And so the story that, we get told in these classrooms is, women are playing a balance, the ovulatory shift stuff has gone out of style, right? That was an element of this. But in any case, even if there's no shifts at ovulation, the idea is that there's a balancing act in place where you have to balance the benefits and costs of masculinity, and the costs are usually related to, this guy's not going to be a good dad. But now you've just told me, right, that beards, the most sexually dimorphic visual trait and the most obviously masculine trait, right? You're saying that it comes out as better than facial masculinity at communicating the typical signals of masculinity. That trait is more popular among new mothers. This sounds like a disaster for the masculinity trade-off stuff. So I guess I would love to have you, if you've got another 10 minutes or so, sure, if you could weigh in on the masculinity trade-off debate, I'd be so grateful for that. And then if you could also maybe help me screw my own head back on with regards to how this beard finding could fit in a coherent way. I mean, I totally believe that the finding is real and robust. Like there's no worry that it's just a wonky finding. It's more just how could the narrative, this clean narrative that we've been telling ourselves about masculinity and mate choice, how could it make sense anymore in the context of this sort of finding?
Yeah, honestly, everything you just said, it sounds like the introductions to most of my papers in the last 5 years. It's like there's, on the one hand, masculinity has these benefits to it, but on the other hand, it has these drastically negative connotations sociosexually. I mean, all the way down to infidelity, which is costly for mothers, and also violence and all these aspects, right, which would not be good at all. And I think when you have on the one hand something and on the other hand something else, it's amazing for people doing research, because you can then use that hypothesis and really clearly test it. Does it fall on that one hand, or does it fall on the other hand in terms of the results, or does it land somewhere in the middle? And so this is no disrespect to the mating strategy theorists, and Steve Gangestad put that forward in his. It's a really famous paper in our field, the strategic pluralism paper in behavioral and brain sciences in 2000, I believe. And it's still just as relevant today as it was back then. I just wonder, my take on it is, it is a nice narrative, and it's conveniently nice if you're going to restrict yourself to things that are just that muscularity and facial masculinity literature. And what I've done here is stumble on something that seems to land awkwardly away from that. And using those theories that I've come across in evolutionary psychology, again, these are some of the greatest researchers in our field, right, that have come up with these things. So it's no disrespect to them. It's just, it doesn't seem to hold up when you start to look at what you would call visually conspicuous ornamentation. It just doesn't relate directly to formidability in the same way. It doesn't have the same, if any, biological costs, and the social costs are not seemingly there. There is a paper that came out by, I believe it was Jan Havilček's research group in the Czech Republic, where I don't know if Jan was on that paper, but they looked at long-term partners and reproductive success, and long-term partners, women with long-term partners who were bearded had higher reproductive success as well. So, and I kind of read that paper and was very, very surprised to see it, because that was the first paper that like directly linked reproductive success with this characteristic that I've been studying. And I thought, but like you, I'm kind of like, well, if it's also now linked to reproductive success, and particularly preferred among women when judging parenting abilities and nurturance, who have, babies under the age of 1 who are so helpless and mums require all the support they can get, this really does fall against the dominant narrative. And my thing about it is, well, let's rewrite the narrative, I suppose. Let's have more of a debate about multivariate masculinity and sexual selection. And just, I'm always the person that's just like, well, let's see how this holds up. Let's throw more experiments at this hypothesis and see if it holds up. We're trying to disprove the things that we accept, I believe, more than trying to prove how we think the world works. So why not throw a multivariate experiment at this and say, well, let's manipulate all the masculine traits in concert. So height, muscularity versus body fat, facial masculinity versus lower facial masculinity, beardedness versus none, or beardedness versus graded beardedness, and see which traits show the strongest effects in concert or independently of one another. That would be an experiment moving forward. Do it under the mating strategies theory. Is it really a trade-off between short-term, let's have a date or potentially have sex, versus now I'm considering a pair bonding situation with dependent infants, or maybe a graded type of mating context where you could then look at the correlations among those multivariate interactions and graded types of mating. It's not always pigeonholed into short versus long term. That again is a construct of our research looking to be experimental, but perhaps missing nuance. So I know I've dodged the question a little bit, but it's because I don't, and this is just all honesty as someone who does research, I honestly don't have the answer right now, other than let's do more multivariate complex experiments to identify the target of sexual selection more fully.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't interpret that as prevaricating at all. I thought that was very much. I thought that was a strong answer. I guess the two things that are coming to mind immediately. One, I'm now left even more confused about the reason beards aren't attractive. You're now telling me that not only is it a signal I'm more dominant, not only is it a signal, that I'm older and have male reproductive status, but it also shows that, I'm going to be a better dad and they're going to have, higher reproductive success. The idea that, a trait that shows all these things could be, coming out in studies as kind of attractive. That's still, bewildering, but I totally accept that. The numbers are in on that point. And then the second thing is just to point out with this masculinity trade-off narrative that I totally agree that a multivariate approach is the only way forward. Because one of the things that's so seductive about the masculinity trade-off is that there are some traits where it works really well, right?
Yes.
Like muscularity, which you mentioned. It's like, yep, women care about it more for short-term than long-term partners, right? And yes, it's correlated with infidelity, right? But it's also correlated with, basic appeal. And it's a pretty clear signal. I mean, if we're going to use the word, genetic robustness to refer to anything, what are we referring to if it's not men who are stronger and more physically robust? So there are some traits where it's like, oh, masculinity trade-off, a masculinity paradox, that does seem right. But beards, this is again, as I said, it does seem like worst case scenario to be. It's like we've got this masculine trait, right, that should be signaling all the same things that muscularity does, and yet it's more attractive to women with young kids than gosh. Anyway, I guess I will end on a mystery, but I'm walking away with being a little clear on the fact that it's not attraction that's the driving force behind beards. It's probably something to do with male competition, and maybe I guess the next 10 years will show hopefully something to do with parenting ability. Barnaby, thank you so much for coming on the show. I couldn't be more grateful for you giving me a couple hours of your time.
No, it's my pleasure. I really enjoyed it. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you again to Barnaby for being so generous with his time. That was really something special. For those who want more of his work, I've provided some links in the show description. Thank you to the donors, and thank you all for listening. And also thank you for your patience. I recognize that research has made it very difficult for me to keep up the podcast the way I'd like to, especially given my other public science communication efforts over on TikTok and similar websites. But the show isn't over. Many of you have reached out to me asking if this is the end, and it certainly isn't. We've just published an episode now, and I've actually got another full episode recorded that I'm just waiting to release, and probably will release in mid-November to create some space here. And if we can get onto a pace of about one solid episode a month, I'll be pretty happy. Although I recognize that that is a massive disappointment to some of you who were around during the weekly days so long ago. Anyway, I very much hope you all enjoyed the last couple of hours. I'll release another episode in probably a few weeks, maybe less. Until then, have a very happy Halloween, and remember to be kind to animals.